All right. So first, this morning, we're going to have Alex Malafeev. He is the co-founder of Sensor Tower, based out of San Francisco. He will be speaking about growth trends in the global app ecosystem and how publishers and developers can stay ahead of the competitive trend. Alex, let's give him a round of a hand.
Hey, thanks, folks. Can everybody hear me all right? I can speak loudly or through this goose mic. So I want to talk about global trends in the app ecosystem and sort of like how we think about these things. Sensor Tower, I'm the co-founder of this company. We focus on competitive mobile intelligence for applications. So downloads and revenue, advertising, usage, and sort of how apps look like. And we get to look a lot on apps from a very high-level perspective. And we also get to work with a lot of sort of the biggest publishers in the space, and we have a lot of insight in the trends that are happening, and the sort of the data that drives a lot of our products is sort of supported by a lot of the data points from some of these biggest publishers. And I want to talk about some major trends that are happening in the ecosystem to give you sort of perspectives of what's coming up, mostly focused on the non-gaming perspective, but there's a couple of gaming things that we'd focus on as well. So I want to talk about the market, just what's the size of the market and how much is it growing. And when we talk about the market, this is the App Store revenue. So this is net revenue, not even the advertising piece that Apple and Google pay out to developers. And the market is something like $40 billion a year right now between iOS and Android. And this is excluding Android in China, with iOS being roughly twice the size of Android in terms of revenue, and Android being twice the size of iOS in terms of sort of the net downloads that they're getting. And the market is still growing at a pretty healthy, double-digit rate. And in fact, Android and iOS have both sort of slow down in growth, but there are sort of interesting trends that are happening in specific categories or genres that are a little bit different. And so when we think about the mobile revenue of applications, so this is mobile apps in general, this is what the breakdown between the countries and iOS and Android looks like. China, US, and Japan are the major markets, with China not being present on Google Play, and Korea sort of being a very strong third on that. And these countries are growing at a pretty fast pace. The rest of the world, like Europe, etc., are still growing at pretty decent pace as well. And there's some distinctions in terms of market penetration between, let's say, Android and Korea versus iOS because of the prevalence of the handsets in those markets. And when we think about the categories, and these are non-gaming categories that are generating revenue on both of these platforms, there's some interesting trends that sort of started happening in the last year, specifically with entertainment, social networking, and music, like surging in revenue growth ahead of the rest of the sort of app ecosystem, outpacing the norm and outpacing the growth in revenue. And so this is sort of the breakdown of what are the largest sort of categories that are generating revenue in 2016, 2017, the rolling 1 year. And so these are pretty large markets. This is excluding games, which sort of historically games has been growing faster than non-gaming applications. Game developers are the first to go and sort of jump on new monetization trends. But something interesting happened, especially toward the second half of 2017. Non-gaming apps accelerated in growth. They were growing 32% year over year in 2016, up to 62 and then 75% year over year. And why is that happening? Well, it's sort of pretty obvious, driven by subscription applications and driven by the sort of revenue split share that Apple and Google introduced to non-gaming applications with subscription. And when we think about the market share the non-gaming apps took, and this is sort of the total size of the pie between gaming and non-gaming, games sort of, from the start of the App Store going into 2015, 2016, etc., games became the biggest part. Something like 83% of all revenue was coming from games. But we're seeing this trend reversed, and it's not because games are getting smaller. Games are still growing. It's just that the other parts of the app ecosystem are growing faster. And we're going to talk about, some of the examples of what is happening, and these are trends that everybody should be sort of thinking about as well. So what is going on with some of these apps, and what is driving a lot of this growth? Well, we talked a lot about the categories that are driving this growth, and photo and video and entertainment, SVOD apps, etc., are driving a lot of this. So the growth is happening across many of these categories and industries. Right, every non-gaming industry is experiencing faster growth compared to 2016. And it's not only driven by subscription, it's driven by a lot of the sort of new monetization methods and perspectives to focus on longer term audience development that developers and publishers are focusing on. And so if we highlight the biggest specific countries that are driving a lot of this growth, well, United States is still sort of outpacing China in terms of revenue from non-gaming applications. And the reason this is happening is because the way content monetization and et cetera exists in the United States, it's a little bit easier to be a large publisher and monetize users in the US and the Western markets right now compared to China. But China is going to catch up to that eventually. The similar sort of dating and SVOD and music apps are taking off in China and the rest of the Asian markets. And looking at the specific genres that are driving this growth, well, if we talk about who was on top of the grossing charts in the App Store, let's say in 2016, it was mostly games with Spotify or another app occasionally showing up there. In 2017, there were a couple of apps, Netflix and Pandora are on top of the top 5. When we look at 2018, right, you don't see Clash of Clans or Game of War anymore. They're in spot number 5, spot number 6. There's some new up-and-coming games like Fortnite and maybe PUBG will be there eventually that are monetizing. But majority of the revenue of the top 5 applications, at least, is music, photo, video, entertainment, dating, these sort of applications, because the subscription model is working really, really well for these apps. And so if we dive a little bit deeper in the SVOD segment, right, it's being led pretty much by Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, and HBO. A lot of revenue, right? A lot of revenue growth and very sustainable revenue growth year over year. These business models are very, very valuable because this is a pretty reliable revenue source, right? Once you have folks that are subscribed on a yearly basis, you don't need to worry about releasing the next expansion. You just need to keep your content production going, and the subscriptions are going to continue monetization. And looking at specifically Netflix is growing actually even faster outside of its major market, the United States. In Q1, it grew 85% year over year in the United States on mobile. It's really fast, right? And Netflix has multiple revenue models. They also monetize on the web as well, but a large part of their revenue is coming from mobile. But they grew 170% outside of the U.S. market, and by focusing on content, by focusing on providing the sort of experiences and latency, et cetera, in other markets. And so there's a lot of opportunity right now. Half of their revenue is coming from outside of the U.S., and it's growing faster. Now, subscription apps like Tinder have had a lot of successes introducing multiple tiers of subscriptions, right? Here's Tinder's revenue, and it's been growing pretty well, and it's been a very successful sort of acquisition for IAC. But here you can literally see that on October, when Tinder Gold, which was like a higher tier monetization option, subscription option, was released, it was sort of a step function for revenue for Tinder. And we see applications continue to bring multiple subscription options to their monetization strategies and are able to extract the better incremental revenue from the users, right? It's not only the $5 subscription now. There's a $5 and $7 and $10 and the family plan for Netflix. And these are very substantial revenue impact strategies. And again, you can literally see this in the revenue that Tinder is generating across all the markets that they're in. Now, there are a couple of other sort of things happening. When we think about the other part of spending on mobile, e-commerce is really, really big. And here is sort of e-commerce downloads. And you can see the holiday seasons are these roller coaster sort of shapes, driven largely by Wish, Amazon, and eBay, the biggest players in the mobile app e-commerce side. There's a couple others like Alibaba, etc., outside of the U.S. But these folks drive a tremendous amount of advertising purchase. They're probably some of the biggest clients on Facebook and Google, etc. And they're generating a lot of revenue through actual real-world purchases and etc. So there's a whole huge another part of the sort of app monetization ecosystem. And so I want to talk about some other sort of interesting trends that we'd also seen with some new and up-and-coming subgenres or categories of apps. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Hooked and Yarn. These are these sort of chat story apps. Well, they've sort of exploded, similar to how the sport betting apps exploded a couple years ago. These apps are doing really well. They're growing. They're monetizing a new and interesting user base. And again, they have a pretty sustainable revenue model. And again, you wouldn't think a couple of years ago that a genre like this could exist, chat story apps, but they're very, very powerful. And something that's sort of coming, and we're seeing a lot of trend and sort of focus from Apple are AR apps. So here's a chart of the sort of cumulative AR app downloads worldwide. And you can see that it's going well. There's not really a huge another runaway hit like Pokemon Go was on the AR side, but as more technology gets introduced and more sort of focus gets put on these sort of applications, you're going to see the next tier or level or set of applications that are going to focus on AR technology and are going to bring a lot of business impact to the companies that publish those apps. Right now, it's a lot of games and utilities and entertainment apps, but again, as the device technology from Apple and from Google continues improving, we're going to see new business models emerge and new markets open up that we weren't thinking about a couple of years ago. Still early on, there's not been anywhere close to another runaway success like Pokemon Go was, but we might eventually see that. And finally, sort of going to games, I want to wrap up and talk about where we are in the games market. When we think about the games revenue, China is like really far ahead of the world. Monetization there on iOS is incredibly high. It's overtaken, Japan and the US is the second biggest in sort of, the second half of 2016, and it shows no sign of stopping. The pace of market development in China is incredibly fast. The games there are very competitive. They're very much core played by users, both male and female, and we're going to continue seeing China be a huge part. It's kind of hard for Western publishers to go into that market and do well. There's only a few that we know that succeed. A lot of times they have to go and publish with a partner there, but it's a huge, huge market. But when we look at on the U.S. market, still dominated sort of by the same folks that we're seeing succeed over the last couple of years. So King is still successful, Supercell is still successful. The casino genre, like Playtika and others, has grown pretty well. But there's also a new huge trend going on with survival games, right? Fortnite and PUBG and Knives Out and a couple other titles that were released are doing really, really well. And we see these titles continue to move up and displace some of the previous, strategy-oriented games as mobile handsets have gotten to a point where you can play, multiple 100-person battle royale. So games are still healthy, just not as growing as fast as some of the other categories. And so as a sort of takeaway, when we look at all the data in the mobile app ecosystem, we have a very positive market outlook. We're growing at double digits. Some categories are growing over triple digits in percent year over year. There's a lot of innovation going on, both inside games with the focus on live ops and focus on monetizing users over long term, but also bringing some of those innovative strategies to non-gaming apps and the sort of things that we're seeing in subscription and those sort of monetizations of applications are really encouraging because the market has a lot of room to grow. And there's a lot of diverse genres of apps that are succeeding. Streaming apps, social apps, chat story apps, AR apps. These are all categories that are showing very promising trajectories that everybody should be thinking about, whether development or partnerships. And finally, subscription apps drives a lot of revenue, right? We've seen that increase in revenue and monetization because the subscription revenue split has encouraged publishers and developers to put more effort, and we're seeing that pay off dividends, right? Netflix and Tinder and a lot of those others are top grossing apps, and when we were thinking about the mobile app ecosystem just 2 or 3 years ago, we wouldn't think that games would be displaced. And this is a sign of a healthy app ecosystem. As more consumers are just spending their whole lives on these devices, we're seeing more and more monetization opportunities, and this is important for us to keep track of as industry leaders and folks in the industry. So with that in mind, folks, like if you have any questions or want to talk about this anymore, feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about mobile app data and all these industries. I get really excited about it. We might have time for one question.
Do we have anybody who'd like to ask a question in the back? Let me. You get to watch me scurry around all day, bringing my microphone. I wish it was a plate.
Hello. So just a really quick question. With respect to the chat apps and the revenue graphs you were showing with the growth, do you have any retention rates around what any of the
Of the retention rates for those users?
Just curious.
That's an interesting question. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I know that like the games that also are sort of chat or story oriented, the retention rates are typically pretty good because those games or those apps and games focus on releasing new content. But
I wanted to specifically ask about chat apps.
Right.
Just because it's a new category that
Right. I can follow up with that, so feel free to. We can connect that. I just don't have the number off the top of my head.
Thank you so much, Alex. Can we get one more round of applause for Alex Malafeev?
Thanks, folks.